All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Azure Community Conference. Let's get started here in a couple of seconds. Just wait for a few more folks to join in. So I hope everyone's having a great session so far. So the next talk that I'll be doing is, I'm essentially going to be talking about how I built cloudskew.com on Azure. So cloudskew.com is a diagram editor. And we'll take a look at the internals and how it has been built on top of Azure. So a little bit about myself. So I run a small startup here called Skewed Ventures. Essentially, we are building cloudskew.com, the diagramming editor. And we also do a bit of Azure, Angular, and .NET consulting on the side. I'm ex-Microsoft, so used to work in Visual Studio, .NET Core, and Azure. Like I had a pretty long career out there. You can reach me on my Twitter handle, Mithun Shanbag, at Mithun Shanbag. So I'm pretty active on Twitter. Feel free to DM me for any questions on CloudSkew. And I also have a semi-active blog that I try to maintain, mithunshanbag.github.io. So that's about it for me. That's about me. Let's get started with CloudSkew. So what exactly is CloudSkew? So it's a simple diagram editor. So essentially, today, if you need to edit a diagram, essentially you pretty much have to install a software like Visio. But CloudSkew instead runs online inside your browser, so there is no installation required. So you start, just log in and start sketching away. CloudSkew is constrained to mostly cloud architecture diagrams, which means you can't do UML diagrams with it, or you cannot do mind maps and hierarchical diagrams. We stick to simple cloud architecture diagrams for Azure, AWS, GCP, Kubernetes, Oracle Cloud, Elastic Cloud, and those such type of diagrams. It's free, so feel free to use it however you like to. It's currently in public preview. We released it in public preview a couple of months back. So we are just quickly checking in a whole bunch of features before we reach general availability, which should be coming up in a couple of sprints. And we have roughly 28,000 user signups at this point. So it's picking up, usage is picking up. A couple of things I want to talk about, I want to quickly highlight before I dive into the internal architecture. So we are in the process of filing for patents. Some of those, I'll try to be open and transparent about most of the internal architecture, but some of the stuff that we are filing patents on, I may have to obscure a bit of details on those. And obviously for compete reasons, I can't fully disclose the product roadmap. But that said, our architecture, most of the architecture is publicly documented. So I will be doing a deep dive on this today. All right. Let's see. Let's start off by actually taking a look at the app itself. So you can get started. All right. So you can just get started by going to cloudskew.com. That's cloudskew.com. And as you can see, there's no installation required. So it's an online diagram editor. Just runs in your browser. It's free. So here are some samples of diagrams that you can draw. So here's an example of an Alibaba Cloud e-learning solution, rather an e-learning solution built on top of Alibaba Cloud. We support icons and stencils for Alibaba Cloud, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Kubernetes, and a couple other CNCF projects, and Oracle Cloud. So you can take a look at some of the samples. So nothing, out of the ordinary here. So to get started, essentially you just click on this green go to app button, and it'll ask you to log in with either GitHub or LinkedIn. Now I think I'm already logged in with my LinkedIn credentials. So as soon as you log in, you'll get this simple diagram canvas here. It's a 3-pane app. So on the left is the activity bar. So let me just quickly run through the set of features. And some of these features have deep architectural implications. So let me quickly run through a couple of these, the important ones essentially. So here's your activity bar. So it essentially allows you to switch between your icon palette, your diagram repository, your template repository, and your icon preferences. So say, for example, right now you're interested in sketching Azure and AWS diagrams. So you just go select those, and your icon palette will populate itself with AWS and Azure icons. So you could just click on an icon, and that puts it on the canvas, and you can go manipulate its properties as you need to. So you could even create connectors from it and then go join it to other symbols. So yeah, you could always start with the empty diagram here. Or you could start from one of our pre-created templates. So let's say let's actually start with a pre-created template, right? So let's take this microservices on AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. Let's start with that template. Okay, and say, yep, create new diagram. All right. So now we could go, let's say, we need to fit in Azure functions in here somewhere. So let's say we are interested in tracking the change feed of Azure Cosmos DB. So we decide to drop in a function app there. So all you have to do is just put in a function app there, and just drag a connector in from there. Okay. And then you could manipulate the symbol properties. So say, for example, you want to make the color, font color red, or you want to increase the font size. All of that is possible here. Similarly, connector properties, let's say you want to change it from a solid to a dotted or dashed line. You can do that from here. You could increase the line width. You could increase or decrease the opacity and transparency. So, so far it looks like a typical diagramming app. The only advantage being that all the required icons from Azure, AWS, and other cloud providers are readily available in there. So these are all your icons, but search works best. So let's say you're searching for block storage. So you could just type in block, and the EBS icons show up here. Synonym search also works. So let's say you just type in database. Now things like DynamoDB or Cosmos DB will show up here because synonym, they hit a synonym match. So we could drag any of those here onto the canvas. So let's see. After this, you could essentially, so this is your diagram repository. So as and when you keep creating diagrams, this will keep showing up in this tab. I think the limit for the free tier is about 50 diagrams. So that's a pretty large number. And of course, there will be paid plans later on. So if you need to get a, you need to create more than 50, you'll probably have to upgrade to a new pricing tier at a later point. But for now, the free tier is more than good enough. So this tab has all your diagrams. This tab has all the templates from which you can create diagrams. Uh, and this one allows you to switch your icon preferences. Okay. Then coming up to the main menu bar. So essentially you could quick insert symbols here as well. So all the in addition to all the icons, you also have your connectors, you have your commonly used shapes. Say, for example, you need a rectangle or a hexagon or something like that for your diagrams. You could do that. You could pull them off the icon palette straight away. You could also insert custom images. So let's say you're having issues finding an icon. You could just insert a custom PNG or JPEG file. Let's look at an example here. So let's just insert this logo here. So now this gets embedded onto the canvas and you can resize it or adjust its properties however. So that's about how the icon palette works. You could also quick insert a whole bunch of symbols. So let's say I need to add an ellipse onto the canvas here. You could either add it from the icon palette or you could use the quick insert menu. Of course, you could always add text. And of course, yeah. So one of the things that we find is people generally tend to export their diagrams and embed them onto Word or Google Docs, and then wrap the documentation around those docs. Instead, what you could do is you could just open the documentation editor straight away, and then just essentially attach the documentation to the diagram itself. So essentially, when you share this diagram, the documentation travels along with the diagram. So let's just say services on AKS. So it's a rich text editor. So essentially, anything that you can generally do with Microsoft Word, you could use it in this pane. You could do those same actions in this pane. So let's just leave it as this for now. But yeah, essentially this documentation will now travel when you travel with the diagram when you share the diagram. Other things are you could undo or redo your actions. You could zoom in, zoom out, or reset the zoom. And finally, you could export this diagram. So some of the export options, you could either export it as a image. So you could do it in BMP, JPEG, or PNG format. Or if you're interested in dumping out the JSON metadata, you could do that as well. So this essentially saves it to disk. Takes a couple of seconds. So that's what the exported diagram looks like. And of course, you could always print it. Another convenience feature is the ability to save it as an online template. So let's say you could call it my AKS template. Let's say, for constructs like VNets or VPCs or Kubernetes clusters, which are we tend to reuse very often. You could save those constructs as a template, and it's auto saved to CloudSque's backend. So now this appears as a template here. So you want to create a new diagram from this template, you could do that as well. And finally, you could share this diagram. You could generate a URL. So once you generate a URL, anybody with that URL can view that diagram. So they don't need to be logged in. They could just view it anonymously. Right. So they could also see the documentation for the diagram. This is what I meant by the documentation traveling with the diagram. Okay. And yeah, viewers can the viewers cannot modify the diagram, but they can definitely pan, zoom in, and zoom out. Okay. So that's about the feature set. If at any point you find that you would like some more icon sets to be added, you could just click on this GitHub link here, and you could just open a new issue with an icon request. Okay. And similarly, you can also report bugs or request new features using GitHub issues. So that's about, I think that's about it for the features. Oh, one other thing I want to talk about is the autosave feature. So there is no save button in here. So as and when you modify the canvas or drag and drop items on the canvas or modify its properties, everything is saved to CloudSkue's backend. So all of this is persisted in a database on our backend. So you don't have to explicitly do the work of saving it or exporting it out to your local disk. We manage that for you. So all your autosave diagrams, you can see them in this repository here. Autosave has some interesting implications on the architecture, and we'll look at those when we get to that. All right, so that's about it. If you have any questions about the feature set, please feel free to type them in the chat window. I'll be taking a look and will be responding to those in a couple of minutes. But now let's get back to our slides. All right, so let's take a look at what's our playbook for like I said, the product is still in preview version. So the playbook for a product in preview version for versus the playbook for a mature stable product vastly different. So some of our rules of thumb that we follow, we always prefer PaaS and serverless over infrastructure. Given that we have a small team size and we have to release multiple features per sprint, infrastructure maintenance and upgrades are not where we want to focus our energies on. So which is why we prefer things like app services or Azure functions, which are sort of like managed services or entirely serverless. We prefer those over something like a Kubernetes cluster or a virtual machine. It's pay as you go, which means we don't have to pre-reserve any capacity as well. So you just pay what you use. And obviously there's no server management overhead. There's nothing to patch, there's nothing to SSH into. So it's a positive sign. We prefer microservices over monoliths. So we essentially don't pack multiple services on a VM. So essentially all the independently deployable and scalable services, we essentially deploy them as microservices. We release frequently. So every sprint we release multiple features. We often roll back features if it doesn't find any customer engagement or customers have a negative reaction to a feature. We sometimes roll them back as well. The goal is to go from a 0 to 100 as far as like the idea, development, deployment, release. As far as that is concerned, so the goal is to have like a very quick cadence around that process. It's okay if the UI is not 100% aesthetic or polished. Remember, this product is still in public preview. The idea is to get the features out and get feedback on it. And the more you polish a UI, the longer that cycle becomes. So it's okay to get the product out in a working condition in order to like generate feedback more quickly. Let's see. Okay, so it's very important that there are a lot of moving pieces in CloudSkue's infrastructure. So one of the critical things is the infrastructure has to be extremely stable and has to just work. So some of the things like automated provisioning, scaling, monitoring, and alerts have all been automated away. Um, so there is no guesswork involved. So every time you do a check-in, the automated provisioning happens based on some rules. Auto scaling occurs, and based on other metric-based alerts, um, metric-based rules, alerts are triggered. So there's no guesswork involved, and because the infrastructure is pretty stable, we can focus more on the actual user-facing product features rather than repairing the infrastructure. And finally, an important rule of thumb for prototypes is like no premature optimization. So as an example, right? All our backend APIs, we measure the API latency or the response times. And as long as those response times are within an acceptable threshold, we feel that we can avoid something like a Redis cache altogether. So we'll delay adding a Redis cache until the API latencies, the P99 latencies exceed some threshold. So until then, we could do away with unnecessary stuff like in-memory caches or Redis caches. Just keep things simple. All right. With that said, let's actually take a look at the architecture. So what does this look like? By the way, on the CloudSQ website, if you click on About CloudSQ Architecture, everything that I'm going to be talking about today has already been documented. So if at any point, you feel like things are still unclear, you could always go to this article and reread it. Yeah, okay. Now let's take a look at the infrastructure. So at its core, we have two apps. So the first is the landing page, the site that we just saw, the cloudsq.com site, this one. So this one is a static view pressed app. Everything is authored in Markdown. All the images are served out of a CDN. It doesn't talk to any APIs. There's no dynamic content here. It's a plain static site hosted in an Azure account, and I'll get to that piece later. Then the main diagram editor itself is a Angular app. So it uses Angular and TypeScript along with reactive extensions for stream processing. This app, which is basically our diagramming editor here. So all these icons and images are served out of these icons are served out of a CDN. Okay, these are statically cached. However, rest of the stuff, the user's profile, the diagrams, the diagram templates, diagram canvas, all those entities, those are dynamically fetched by talking to a set of backend APIs. Again, this is an Angular app, so it's packaged and served through an Azure storage account. On the backend side, we have two set of APIs. The first one is called CloudSQ APIs. It's a simple CRUD over diagram templates, diagram templates, and user profiles. It's very simple. Basically, just supports get, put, post, delete operations on those three entities. Again, it's entirely authored in .NET Core 3.1 with Entity Framework Core as well. And similarly, print helper APIs are a set of APIs that help you to print and export the diagram. So some of the things like we take care of things like font smoothing and WebKit rendering just to ensure consistency across all browsers. We have these backend APIs, print helper APIs. The reason the print helper APIs are uh, isolated in a separate app service is because it tends to have a higher memory footprint and tends to recycle more often. So which is why we isolated it in a separate app service. Now, as far as okay, so yeah, this is a Angular app, this is a VuePress app, but how are we serving it? So we serve them out of storage accounts. So essentially we enable static site hosting on the storage accounts. So that essentially creates a container called $web on the blob storage, in the blob storage. So we serve it out of this. So the apps are packaged and pushed into the $web container and served out. We have two additional storage accounts. One is for user uploaded custom images. So any PNG or JPEG files that you upload get pushed into the container, into a separate storage account container. Similarly, all the static assets, all the icons that we serve out are done from another storage account. Now the storage accounts are fronted by an Azure CDN. So essentially, we have we have a couple of CDN profiles, each of them mapping to a separate endpoint. And in this case, the endpoints are all storage accounts. The CDN provides a whole lot of benefits. So there's the obvious benefits of caching and compression, right? You have caching at global points of presence, multiple global points of presence, or what we call as POP servers. We also enable Brotli compression, so that gives you up to 40%, compression of the original. So let's say something is 100 GB, you can compress it to up to 40. 100 KB can be compressed to up to 40 KB using Brotli compression. Given that we are using the Azure CDN, there are some additional benefits that we can piggyback on. So one thing is managed TLS certs for custom domains. So as you can see that we are using custom subdomain names here. So we have certs that are managed by Azure CDN. So everything related to let's say auto renewal of certs after expiry, it's all taken care of by Azure CDN itself. And we also do things like HTTP to HTTPS redirection, or Apex domain to www redirection through Azure CDN rewriting rules. And finally, we have a whole bunch of CNAME records in the Azure DNS. So essentially, the subdomain names to CDN endpoint mapping through the CNAME records is done by Azure DNS. So essentially, user hits the DNS endpoint. They go through the CDN profiles, hit a CDN endpoint, and the content is served out from there. Now, on the back end, everything is an app service. And we essentially use ASP.NET Core 3.1 for it. So the advantage of that is the usage of middleware. So things like token authentication or setting up of cores or response compression, Brotli compression in the responses, they can all be configured through ASP.NET middleware. So all these APIs are packaged as ASP.NET Core API apps. And then we essentially have one containerized app service plan. It's a B1 instance, I think. And we have multiple app services inside that app service plan. I'll get to the containerization piece in a few minutes. We turn on managed system assign managed identity on the app service plan, so that the individual, on the individual app services, so that they can go talk to a Azure Key Vault. The reason Azure Key Vault is needed is for externalized configuration. Now the APIs have to go interact with a whole bunch of databases, so they need things like database passwords, endpoint URLs, connection strings. So it's not a good practice to store them in source control. Best to save them in a secure Key Vault. So we have a Azure Key Vault with a custom Key Vault policy. So only managed identity can access those key vaults. Once the apps get deployed or restarted, they essentially, the very first thing they do is read from the key vault and essentially bootstrap themselves. So essentially they know which database to connect up to, or which service bus to go dump the messages on. So all of those configuration details come from the key vault. For authentication, we use Auth0. So essentially, Auth0 is your identity provider. We allow the users to log in with either GitHub or LinkedIn credentials. And then Auth0 essentially serves out ID and access tokens, JWTs basically. We use the implicit OAuth flow, and we also inject a bunch of custom claims inside the JWT. So essentially, this is for differentiating the roles a regular user from an administrator. Is done through custom claims. After this, the SQL Azure is our main persistence layer. So all the entities that the primary entities that we deal with, user profiles, diagrams, diagram templates, essentially get persisted as JSON in SQL Azure. We don't write directly to SQL Azure because there's a whole burst of requests that's caused by the autosave feature. So instead, to level the load, we first write it out to a buffer, which is Azure Service Bus. So all the writes are essentially, they're not committed directly to SQL Azure. They go onto a service bus. And then we have a helper function, which is a function app, uses a service bus input binding. And essentially, this one keeps draining the queue and reading all the commit message, write messages, and then it commits them to SQL Azure. So this ensures that the load on SQL Azure is plateaued and it's always constant. Reads happen through reads happen directly, but writes go through the queue-based load leveling mechanism. After this, we have Azure Cosmos DB, but this is mainly for experimentation purpose. We could pretty much take this out of the production system, and it's not going to affect the user experience. So this is mainly for us to run some graph queries. So essentially, we use the Gremlin APIs to figure out some relationships between like all the connected nodes and vertices. So your icons, which are connected through connectors. We essentially run some experiments, but technically we could take this out and it's not going to affect your user experience. After that, we have App Insights and Azure Monitor. So we use the App Insights SDK both on the front end and the back end. So a simple example is, let's say a user comes and types in, they're searching for some icon and they're not able to find a match. So what we do in that case is we actually record a custom event saying that, hey, this user was unable to find this icon. And we come to know exactly which icon the user was searching for, and then we go ahead and add it. So App Insights is great for collecting all those custom events and metrics. Everything goes into a log analytics workspace, the new App Insights instance, which is workspace based. And we run a whole bunch of Kusto queries to get to those metrics. We also use a whole bunch of alerts, metric-based alerts. So say, for example, the number of dead lettered messages on the service bus grows beyond some threshold. We want to be alerted. Or if the API latency or the response times of these APIs go beyond some threshold, or if there are a whole bunch of 500 server errors happening in these APIs, we want to know about it. So, or if the DB, this is a DTU based database. So if the DTU utilization spikes beyond some threshold, we definitely want to be alerted. So a whole bunch of metrics based alerts have been set up in Azure Monitor. Then let's talk about the DevOps part of it. So we have a whole bunch of Azure repos where the source code resides. So essentially, uh, we use a one repo per app mapping. So essentially, the diagram editor lives in one repo, the landing page lives in another repo, this API lives in another repo. So we use Terraform for provisioning. So all the resources that you see here on this canvas have been provisioned with Terraform, right? So provisioning is mostly a one-time operation. We provision with Terraform. The advantage of using this Terraform script is it becomes very easy to recreate this environment. So we have three replicas of this environment. So we have a dev, a test, and a production replica. So they're all very similar to each other. Sometimes we do, like have scaled down instances of databases. So for example, the production one might have a general purpose tier, but the scaled down dev and test environments may use a like less pricey SKU. So Terraform is essentially what we use for provisioning, but now we're in the process of migrating this to Pulumi as instead of Terraform. Then that's provisioning. Now regular app deployments happen through Azure pipeline. So every time there's a check-in into the main branch, the CI system kicks in and builds, tests, and packages the apps. And then depending on whether it's a front end or a back end app, if it's a front end app, we just deploy them to the $web container in blob storage. If it's a backend app, we essentially create a Docker image out of it and push it to the Azure Container Registry. And there are a whole bunch of webhooks, that go wake up the app service. So the apps are then essentially redeployed. So everything on the backend is containerized, and essentially we have pipeline tasks that go push them into the container registry. So again, high level, all the provisioning, the one-time provisioning happens through Terraform, and the regular updates and deployments happens through pipeline tasks. Okay. One point I do want to make is, when we use the Terraform script to create an environment, we create multiple copies of that environment. Like I said, dev, test, and prod. They are mostly identical, but the dev and test might use some scaled down resources. Also, the other thing is, key vault values will differ. So for example, the database in production will be different from the database in test. So connection strings will obviously be different. So we keep the key vault being a key value store. We keep the key name same, but the values are different. So in prod, this will contain the connection string to the prod database, while in test, it will contain the connection string to the test database. So that's about the high level details of the architecture. If you have more questions, you can always feel free to visit the blog article. If you just go to the cloudskew.com webpage and just click on about architecture. So the exact same thing that I talked about, it's all documented here. But feel free to type in any questions in the chat window. I'll be taking a look at it in a couple of minutes. Okay. After that, so let's now look at some rules of thumbs that we follow, or some edicts that we follow. All right, so that was the CloudSkew architecture we just talked about. Now let's look at some of the rules that we unofficial rules that we follow for while we are building CloudSkew. So we use a microservices based model. Why? Because they are independent units of deployment and scaling. So essentially, rather than packing your front end, back end, and database and other related services on one server, we essentially now have the ability to scale them independently, work on them, develop them independently, deploy them independently. So that way downtime can be minimized. We also prefer serverless and PaaS instead of infrastructure. So as I previously mentioned, there is no, we don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on managing servers. We just want to be, writing our code and deploying. So things like patch management and patch management, server management is stuff that we want to get out of. And given that most PaaS services like app service, they have built-in load balancers, built-in firewall rules. So, they have a whole bunch of what we call intelligent defaults that we can just utilize. So it works for a pretty, given that CloudSQ is an early stage product, most of what Azure's PaaS offerings are, they work very well for us. Also, you can leverage the auto scaling rules of app service or the scale controller rules of Azure Function Apps, and just use those rather than configuring your own VM scale sets and things of that nature. We use a one repository per app rule. So essentially, in our example, we saw that we had a whole bunch of apps. So front end, so it's the diagram editor. Here's the landing page. We have the two backend APIs. So essentially, we use one repository per app. So we deploy to all the environments, the dev environment, test environment, and prod environment from that one repository, right? So let's say we have a repository for the landing page. So that repository is responsible for deploying to all three environments. It's a bad idea to deploy to test from one environment and prod from another. To deploy to test from one repository and deploy to prod from another repository. So this tends to introduce something known as Heisen bugs. So essentially bugs that are only reproducible in prod but not reproducible in test. So we try to avoid that. Also, it's a bad idea to have one repository for all apps. This just couples them very strongly together. Best to keep them separated. We want to avoid code duplication. So what we end up doing is we use the GitHub package registry. So essentially for our front-end apps, a whole bunch of functionality is extracted out as NPM packages. In our backend, a whole bunch of common functionality is extracted out as NuGet packages. And we go publish those to the package registries. So one example is you have the diagram editor, and whenever somebody shares a diagram, the person with the shared link can just view it through the diagram viewer. So the diagram editor and the diagram viewer share a whole bunch of components, and all those components are packaged as NPM packages. Always avoid installing the latest package version when you do an NPM install or a build, because this might, if you just install the latest package, you are susceptible to breaking changes. So instead, just use pinned package versions. So even if the package has a later version, you'd still be pinned to the specific version, and that way you avoid breaking changes. Externalized configuration. So like I mentioned, it's a bad idea to put an app and its configuration together, and it's especially bad to keep them in source control. So configuration generally refers to passwords, connection strings, endpoint URLs, etc. So it's always a bad idea to put them in source control. So take all the configuration out and put them in a secure key vault or secure key value store, something like KMS in AWS or Key Vault in Azure. And you would have access policies that restricts access to the to that key vault. So in our case, all the app configuration is stored in Azure Key Vault. And like I mentioned, we keep the key names same in dev, test, and prod environment, but the values change. So essentially, we have 3 key vaults in 3 different environments. They all have the same key names, but the values change. So for example, if if the app is being deployed in test, it should use the connection string to the test database and not the connection string to the prod database. So that way it will pick up the right key value, right configuration depending on which environment it is in. And of course, the only entities that can access the key vault are the ones with managed identity. So we enable managed identities on the individual app services and function apps, and only those are able to go read from the key vault. The whole point of having an external key vault is so that when apps are deployed, they should just be able to access those configuration settings and then bootstrap themselves straight away. So once the app has been deployed, you should not be required to run any scripts or any CLI commands to configure an already deployed app. So the deployed app should know how to start itself up. So as soon as the app gets redeployed or restarted, the very first thing it should do is read from the key vault and know how to bootstrap itself. And if this fails, you should generally do a graceful shutdown. And if that's not possible, just dump out verbose logs. So that will help you troubleshoot. Always plan for loosely coupled microservices that coordinate in an asynchronous fashion. So typically this is done using gRPC or service bus or other message buses. We prefer service bus because it has a whole bunch of built-in mechanisms for dead letter messages, poison messages, even patterns like competing consumers. You want to have auto scale out the number of competing consumers to drain out the queue faster. All those patterns are inherently supported by service bus. So other things like you want to have timeouts or backoffs or retries on when you fail to process a message. So those things are easier to configure with service bus. So we generally prefer service bus over gRPC, which comes with the whole bunch. gRPC requires a whole bunch of scaffolding to get itself set up. Service buses are much easier. With asynchronous microservices, you do have to become comfortable with weaker consistency models, which means you may have multiple replicas of your, let's say, for example, multiple replicas of your database, and you may be reading from a read replica. So the reads may lag the writes, and your microservice has to be okay with that. Okay. Stateless microservices. So always plan for all your microservices to be stateless. Essentially, don't store anything in memory, because we always run under the assumption that a microservice can be restarted or redeployed at any time. So we don't want it to lose any in-memory state. So like I said, in-memory state cannot be persisted. That cannot be persisted on exit or on a crash is state that is lost. So ensure that everything is stored in caches or databases, and avoid sticky sessions and affinities, right? Because given that an app the backend service can be restarted at any point, you may lose that session. So we prefer things like, for user identity, we essentially use ID and access tokens. So that's much better than using sticky sessions. It's possible to auto scale your services out. The simplest scaling technique is a manual slider. So essentially, you scale it from like one instance serving traffic to say 3 instance serving traffic. And for some of the lower end app service queues, this is the only option available. So let's say you create a B1 app service, B1 queue. Auto scaling is not enabled on it, so you will have to just manually scale it out when the traffic increases. It's for some of the higher queues, it's possible to have pre-scheduled scaling. So which says that, okay, at Friday 6 p.m. Scale the service up or scale the service down to scale the services out to X number of instances, and that's possible to do that with scheduled scaling. You can have a rule-based scaling as well. So an example would be, let's say your service bus queue size grows beyond some threshold. So you want to increase the number of listeners or consumers, so that you can drain the queue faster. So you can have queue-based scaling. Another one is, let's say you have a backend API and the rate of incoming requests is going beyond some threshold. And at that point, you want to create multiple instances of that backend API to serve that traffic out without a performance penalty. So rule-based scaling helps in that scenario. But it's also, some cases it's better to use the built-in scaling rules. So for example, Azure Function Apps use something called as a scale controller. So the heuristics of the scale controller are not exactly known, but you can just trust it to dynamically scale out, your HTTP function apps, or if you have some data triggered data triggered bindings. You can rely on the scale controller to scale out your listeners. Next important thing, make sure you're logging everything. So remember, we are using a PaaS serverless model. So there are no servers to SSH into, or even if there is, for example, like with app service, there is a server there, but you don't have access to it. So you can't SSH into it. So your App Insight traces are all you have. Your logs are all you have. So you should be able to change your log verbosity by changing a setting in the key vault. So essentially, every time your app restarts or gets redeployed, one of the things it should do on startup is to figure out the log verbosity level from the key vault. And by changing this, the app should be able to dynamically adjust its log verbosity levels. As far as user metrics are concerned, we do collect a whole bunch of them, but we make sure that all the metrics are anonymized and all the PII information is stripped out. So one example that I talked about was, the icon, when the user types in an icon name and that doesn't generate a match, we would like to know about it. So we get that as a custom event, but we don't specifically know which user generated that event. All we know is the icon name that didn't generate a match. Everything else, we essentially, all the diagram metadata is persisted as JSON on our in our DB, so we could mine from that. This is why we run the graph queries using the Gremlin APIs. So we keep the custom events to a minimum. So essentially, stuff that we cannot mine from the graph metadata. As far as system metrics go, so there are some things that we want to observe. So given that we are using SQL Azure, which is a managed database, so we use the DTU based utilization. So some things we observe are the average DTU utilization, average query execution time. For our APIs, we constantly monitor if there are any 500 errors, server-side errors, and we look at the response time and latencies. For service bus, in our queue-based load leveling pattern, so we look at the growth in the number of dead lettered messages, and we also look at the average time a message has to wait in the service bus before it is processed. So next thing we do is we identify what we call as yellow and red thresholds. Yellow are acceptable. Red is, when you exceed the red threshold, probably time to generate an alert. So we have Azure dashboards to visualize these. So this is what it would look like. So this is our DTU utilization graph. Anyways. So yeah, we have a whole bunch of metric-based alerts. So essentially that sends you a Slack message or an SMS or an email through an action group in Azure Monitor. Another important thing is to ensure that all deployments happen through service principals only. So service principals or service account, whatever you want to call them, only those should have access to write to the dev, test, and prod environments. So we create service principals not just for the prod environment, but also for dev and test. So again, no manual accesses. We don't allow manual access to the prod. So essentially, we just have to, if something goes wrong, the logs are all that we have to fall back on. So ensure that all the logs are pretty verbose. Try to ensure dev test prod parity. So we use Terraform or Pulumi, or you can choose any other infrastructure as code solution to set up environment, identical environments. They should differ only in the Key Vault, in the app configuration values. So in the dev environment, you should be able to connect to the dev database. In the prod, you should be able to connect up to the prod database, and so on and so forth. So the key value, as far as the key value store is concerned, the Azure Key Vault, the key names will be the same, the values will be different. Autosave. So we generate a whole bunch of events on the front end. And every time an event is generated, let's say you resize an icon or you change an icon properties, an event is generated, and we do want to autosave when that event is raised. But that leads to a burst of events. So there are some techniques that we use. So the two techniques are, on the front end, we use something known as debouncing, and on the back end, we use throttling or rate limiting. So debouncing is, you wait for a period of inactivity before you generate the request to the backend. So let's say you have a burst of 50 requests. So you don't immediately write all 50 requests. You essentially wait for some threshold, let's say 500 milliseconds. And if no further requests are generated after 500 milliseconds, you essentially coalesce all the events together and send one request to the backend. So that's debouncing. Rate limiting is different. Well, let's say in rate limiting, so debouncing happens on the front end side, rate limiting and throttling happen on the backend side. So rate limiting would be, you only allow the backend to process 50 requests per second. On the 51st request, you get an access denied error. So, we use a combination of both. And this is primarily to ensure that the autosave function doesn't overwhelm our backend and the database. And the other technique we use is the queue-based load leveling. So we don't commit writes directly to databases. So this would actually spike the DTU utilization. Instead, what we do is we just take all the write requests and commit them. Instead of committing them to the database, we commit them to a message buffer, the service bus, and then we asynchronously drain them using a function app, and then we write it. So that will ensure that the load on the database is constant and under the threshold. We also use Brotli compression on the ASP.NET Core backend. So that will reduce your payload sizes to up to 40%. And finally, use CDN wherever you can. So the caching and compression benefits are pretty obvious. Remember to purge your point of presence servers when you have non-additive or breaking changes. TLS certs are managed by CDN. So if you're using custom domains, and you want a TLS cert for it, CDN manages those, Azure CDN manages the certs, and it takes care of renewal after expiry as well. And of course, you can have your HTTP to HTTPS rerouting or rewriting rules through Azure CDN. Another important thing is try to leverage an external identity provider as far as possible and not roll out your own. In our system, we could have done away with the login requirement, but given that all diagrams are auto-saved, and we have a bunch of other upcoming features like snapshotting and restoring from snapshots, versioning, etc. So that requires users to be authenticated. So we use Auth0 as our identity provider, and we use the, given that we are a single page application, we use the implicit grant flow. If you are a server side, something like a pure ASP.NET app or a Ruby on Rails app, you would be using the authorization code grant flow. Don't store user credentials in the database. So we don't get any of those details. Auth0 has those details. We don't get it in our. So even if our database is breached, the user credential details are never leaked out because there are none to begin with. Again, use an external identity provider. So there's a bunch of them: Cognito, Okta, Auth0, Firebase. If you're using, if ASP.NET users might be familiar with Identity Server 4 as well. So that's also a pretty popular one. Again, JWT tokens instead of session-based affinities. Okay. Given that usage is increasing, the both daily active and monthly active users are the usage is spiking. We have to make a bunch of architectural enhancements soon. So right now it's deployed to one region, West Europe. So very soon we'll be looking at doing multi-regional deployments and routing traffic through Traffic Manager. So we are using the B1 SKUs for all our apps, the APIs that we serve from the app service. So we want to leverage things like slot swapping. So this is useful for serving out pre-warmed instances of app service. We also want to leverage auto scaling rules. So we'll probably be moving up to a more expensive pricing tier. Right now, all the API latencies are within the threshold. So we are not using Redis cache, or we are not using ASP.NET's iMemory cache, but that's something we'll look at using once the usage grows. Currently, all releases to production are manual. We don't use feature flags, or we don't use blue-green deployments, but we do want to perform some sort of A/B tests. So we'll look at blue-green deployments going forward. And for all of our business KPI tracking, we may end up using a Power BI or Grafana dashboard. So that's about all I had for this session. Once again, feel free to go play around with the app. So the website is cloudskew.com. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them on the chat window. I'll be taking a look at it. And that's it. I think that's all I had for the presentation today. So thanks everyone. Hope you hope you had fun, learned something new. And once again, feel free to use the chat window. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter via DM or something. The link to my Twitter profile is on the webpage. So yeah, I look forward to hearing back from you. And thanks everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions today. Thanks.